Good to see you tonight for session 2 of Just Walk Across the Room. Look, one thing I love about this study is that it very simply lays out the subject of evangelism in a very practical way that makes it so easy to do. A lot of us come to the idea of being evangelist with some baggage and preconceived notions of what it means to be an evangelist or be evangelistic. And I think this session, this study shows us that it's really not all that hard. I particularly like this session, Living in 3D, because if you look ahead, you know what the 3Ds are about developing friendships, discovering stories, and discerning appropriate next steps based on leadings of the Holy Spirit. That's pretty simple, and that's all it is. And I would also say, especially in this time of COVID, you know, some of you on the line know that I've been spending some time with thinking about resilience and put together a resilience program for folks at work. And it did it here a couple Sundays ago. And you know that developing friendships is and a social support network is a core component of any resilience model out there. So thinking about living in 3D from that perspective, not for our own benefit, but for the benefit of those around us, being someone who can be a friend and be a support, may even have, I guess, pay additional dividends in terms of the value that you deliver. Not only do you have an opportunity to share the gospel, but you also have an opportunity to help that individual through what very well may be a difficult time. I'll tell you that I've used this phrase several times in the last 6 months, referring to COVID, that we're all in the same storm, going through the same storm, but we're in different boats. And from a resilience standpoint, you just don't know what people are going through. I did the session today for my team at work, and immediately afterwards, I had a text message from one of our members who said this was so timely because just yesterday, one of his classmates took his own life, committed suicide over in Afghanistan. And so, again, we just don't know what people are going through. And now, more so than any other time, is a great time, excuse me, a great time for us to consider what living in 3D might look like. So with that, can I get a thumbs up that you do see the screen living in 3D from the video? Got it. Okay, thank you for that. And now I'm going to play the introductory segments, about a minute.
It's sort of embarrassing for me to admit, but still, these days, I can sometimes get so caught up in my own world, in my own agenda, my own to-do list, that when I'm driving home, I can drive right past neighbors' houses and not be concerned about the spiritual well-being of people who live in them. I can go to a restaurant and be more concerned about the subject matter that we're going to discuss over lunch or the food than I am the people around me or those who serve me. And I just have to keep reminding myself it's all about people, and I have to increase my own awareness of the fact that I'm here to touch people, to love people, to try to point people to faith. And I'm probably not alone in this. There's probably others who have the similar awareness challenge. I think all of us as Christ followers have to ask ourselves the question, who are my neighbors? Who are these people that I work with? Do I care about them? Is my heart open to loving them, serving them, maybe discovering their story and listening to promptings about pointing them to faith? I think we're all responsible for that.
Well, I want to play a little icebreaker. It's only going to be a few moments. I'll tell you that when I did this the first time, it was a real challenge to me. And this was, as I say, maybe 8 years ago when I did this study. The idea was, do you know your neighbors? And literally, we're talking about the neighbors either in your apartment complex or on your street, those who have a physical presence living day by day in your immediate vicinity. And I was challenged by that and did ultimately through this get to know my neighbors. I knew the person across the street and to the right, across the street to the left, the person next to me on my right, to my left, and the back door neighbor across the yard. And I could ultimately answer the following questions that I want to quiz you on. And this is a rhetorical quiz. You don't need to shout this out. I'm going to ask you, if you have your books, then you'll see that I'm reading from page 24 in the study guide. But could you write the names of 6 neighbors in those blanks, or just name 6 people, 6 neighbors in your immediate vicinity? And if you can't do that, boy, that's a real showstopper right there. But let's continue and play along. Let's say you know the names of the 6 people there around you. Do you know how many years each one has been living there? Do you know what occupations are represented in those families? Maybe the husband and the wife work, maybe just one works. Maybe they're not married, maybe they're just a couple. Which of those neighbors are Christians? How many of them have ever been inside your home? I've mentioned to some folks at work, it doesn't matter the context, but they wanted to know how well I knew somebody. And I said, well, if it's any measure, they've been inside my house. And actually it was referring to the contracting officer for our company, because the contracting officer's husband was a very good friend of mine through Toastmasters. And they said, wow, they've been inside your house. That's really rare. And indeed, having someone in your home, think about the people, who've been in your home. That's kind of an intimate setting, and, very rare that happens these days. So how many of those 6 people, neighbors, have been inside your home? And then how many have you had a meaningful conversation with in the last month? So I think these are terrific questions to think about how easy it could be to get to know your neighbors, but how far removed the reality is from how well we happen to know our neighbors. Before I move on to the video lesson tonight, which is about 15 minutes, does anybody have any observations about that? Would like to respond to what I just said in those questions? Okay, then, let's play the lesson.
When I was just a little kid, my father introduced me to sailing and sailboat racing. And immediately from the first time I was on a race boat, it was like an adrenaline rush. And I wanted to do it more and more and more. And most of my junior high and senior high years in the summer, I was on that boat. When I'm on a boat and feel the motion and the breeze, and then you mix in some good friendships with that equation, and for me, that's as good as it gets. So that's your run line there, if you want to trim to it. About 15 years into the development of Willow Creek, I realized that I needed to do a little replenishing and recalibrating in the summertime due to some of the pressures of church work. And we rented a little cottage here in South Haven, Michigan, and I guess originally I thought, well, this is where I won't be known as a Christian and as a Christian leader, and I can just fly beneath the radar and stay real low key here. But what I was not anticipating was getting into sailboat racing and developing an entire network of relationships that were not church focused. These are people who would never really be able to attend our church because of the 3-hour time distance. Yet I could see God starting to stir and work in some of the lives of the people that I befriended and raced sailboats with in the town here. I'm just one of the guys who, has found faith and try to spread that as naturally as possible in just normal recreational contexts.
Well, I was involved in a sailing team here in South Haven for quite a number of years, guys that I've sailed with competitively for quite some time. And all of a sudden I got a phone call out of the blue from Tommy saying that we were not going to sail our regular program and that we were going to sail with this pastor from Chicago. And I just about hit the floor. I kind of had made a comment to Tommy that I said, why would we be doing that? I can't believe that we'd be changing programs, and felt at that time that the fun meter was really going to go from like 11 to 2.
I remember the first time we went out to practice with this new sailing team, and I was being introduced to each of the guys. When I got to Dave Wright, they called him Super, or sometimes they'd call him Soup. And I thought it was a little strange until I discovered over the next few weeks he was just a super guy.
When I first met Bill, I was really quite suspicious of what that relationship was going to be like. And I think I moved in a direction of kind of observation, kind of very standoffish.
Sort of the ringleader of this sailing crew that was formed around this racing program that I put together was a guy named Tommy. Wildest guy on the crew, full of life and energy. And shortly after our time of sailing together, maybe a season or two, Tommy got very interested in spiritual things and wound up really starting to read his Bible and doing some real spiritual seeking. And this freaked Dave Wright out.
I mean, he was a close friend, and we spent a little time getting in trouble. And so when he entered into a relationship with Bill, I was really concerned about our friendship changing, and was quite angry at times about that.
I'll never forget the time when, after one of our sailing regattas, where Tom had started to open up to the other guys that he was actually considering Christianity. Super Dave took me off to the side and said, I want you to stop messing with Tommy's mind about this God stuff.
It was customary for Tommy in the wintertime to take a little bit of time off, and Bill had asked him to take a team of folks from Willow Creek down to the British Virgin Islands to do a team building experience. Well, he was doing this now for about a month, and was coming back home, and met him on the jetway, and as we were coming down the ramp, he said, well, you're not going to believe what I did this week. And I said, well, what's that? He goes, well, I became a Christian. And I just thought at that time that aliens had just taken my best friend.
And he thought Tom was going to wind up just really off the deep end. And I was not that concerned because I saw the new work of Christ in Tom's life.
Well, I didn't grow up in the church. I did spend a little bit of time there as a child, and kind of rebelled against that experience. I found it to be quite boring. And then I had 2 other experiences as a teenager. These experiences really got quite strange. I had people putting their hands on me and praying for me, and it was just really quite uncomfortable.
I could tell that Dave was suspicious because I was a pastor. He had never really known a Christian well at that point in his life.
I did come to Christ before my husband did, and it was very important to me that he come to Christ. I never thought I'd get married. I wanted to do life together in entirety with David. And so what did that mean? That if he didn't have a relationship with Christ, this was all going to fall apart. And it was hard to watch David struggle with understanding what a relationship with Christ was and understanding what it meant to be a Christian when people would push things at him.
I saw something so valuable inside Dave, And I remember just saying to myself, this is going to be a long, slow walk. He's got to see a Christian kind of walk the walk. I never put a time span on it. I just said, this is a guy I'd like to be friends with and let God do whatever God's going to do. I really wanted to make sure that it was God doing the work and me riding in the second position.
Before regatta, I was preparing my little area on the sailboat, and Bill would come up and just ask me how my week had gone, how Beth was, maybe what had gone on at work. I mean, the conversations never really moved towards faith or Christianity. And again, it was just so refreshing to me that he was concerned about me as an individual and what was going on in my life.
I think really trying to point someone in the direction of faith is usually the summation of a lot of little inputs along the way. I don't think it's the big 3-hour talk where you start with creation and end at the end of the Bible. I don't think it's a great big theological brain dump all at once.
I remember Bill giving me a copy of Case for Christ before it was ever even in print. And so in my travels around the country, on airplanes, I would pull that out and read a few pages. And I really needed that because I was so inquisitive about the science part of it.
I prayed for him constantly. I asked other people to pray for him. I left books around. I joined a Bible study. He'd ask me questions about what happened at the Bible study, and I'd get sneaky about it. If you're curious, why don't you come?
After a regatta, I'd say, Dave, I'm going to pray for you every day this week, that you'll have a great week, that you'll be aware of this God who loves you. But it was just a series of these little seeds that were planted, inputs that were done, that I think started to gain some momentum over time.
Well, there was a time Bill and I were having breakfast together in a small little restaurant, and he proceeded to draw out the bridge illustration and was just inquiring about where I was at. Was I way on the left side? Was I getting a little closer to accepting God in my life? And I said, Bill, geez, I don't want to hurt your feelings, but I'm like in the next booth.
I was only trying to ascertain where he was. Was he just ready to trust Christ, or was he just a step or two behind where I thought he was? I drove away from the restaurant thinking, man, I thought it'd take a little while, but I might be in for a decade here. He's a hard nut. But he was honest, and that's what you always love about Dave. I'll never forget when Dave called me and said that his dad had suddenly died of a heart attack. And the timing of this in Dave's own process was very worrisome to me, because we had just been talking about the afterlife. We had been talking about the fact that real people spend eternity with God or without Him. And that was hard for Dave to kind of comprehend in and of itself.
I remember my aunt asking whether my father had said some type of prayer in his life, and that would indicate whether he was going to heaven or not. I remember being at my mother's house and just sitting on the floor and being on the phone with Bill and just trying to process some of these things.
But when it came to whether or not his dad was going to wind up in heaven or not, on the basis of his relationship with Christ, and not just on the basis of was he a good guy, because he was a good guy. Those were extremely sensitive conversations that I think wound up being pivotal in Dave's process. At about the 7-year mark, I had become such good friends with Dave, and our lives had intertwined around sailboat racing and friendship, and so I remember getting to a point where I said, I just can't imagine not being in heaven with this guy. And the thought was rolling around in my head, and as he was leaving our Christmas party one Christmas, the thought occurred to me, why don't I just tell him?
He just looked at me and he said, Soup, I'm going to tell you right now, I'm not going to eternity without you.
You know, guys don't say those kinds of things to each other. It just came out of me, and I was like, well, that's how I feel. See ya.
I got in the car and I told Beth, I said, "You're not going to believe what Bill just said to me." And it just came from a place of genuine friendship and love. I mean, that just really made an impact. I mean, I thought about that a lot over the next year. I remember the Christmas Eve service where I had dedicated my life to Christ, and I just finally had decided that it was not worth kind of fighting it anymore. I was just sitting there listening to some worship. I had all my questions answered, and I just really felt it was time for me to say yes.
And Dave turns to me just as I'm helping he and his wife Beth with their coats, and he says, "Oh, by the way, I'm good to go." And I looked at him, I thought, "What do you mean you're good to go? Are you going home? Are you going to a hotel? Or I don't even understand what you're saying." And he had a little twinkle in his eye, and he says, "Like, I'm good to go, man. You got to understand." And then he kind of came out with it and said, "I trusted Christ tonight in the service." And I remember what I said to him. I said, "No way. I mean, I can't believe you did that." And he said, "I thought you'd be happy." And I said, "Well, it's going to take me just a little while to digest that." And he said, "Well, love you," and gave a hug. And then I don't think he had told his wife yet. He was going to tell her in the car on the drive home. But I remember going into my kitchen, and I got Len and my kids around me, and they've been praying for Dave for 8 years. And I said, "Super told me he's good to go." They're like, "What does that mean?" I said, "I didn't know either." And I said, "He trusted Christ tonight." And they all, it was like in a chorus. They were like, "No way." I said, "That's what I said, no way." And I called him the next morning, and we talked about it, and he was just as solid as a rock. He had his questions answered. His heart was ready. He made the decision, and he has never looked back. He has grown consistently, month by month, since that day.
I remember the evening before I got baptized, I was kind of asking Bill about what I should expect that next day. And he looked at me and said, "The only thing you need to know right now is the deeper the sin, the deeper the dunk." I stepped out in the water, and Bill, of course, gently grabbed me and proceeded to dunk me so deep my head hit the bottom of the lake, my tennis shoes came out of the water.
We laugh about it till this day, but there's deep symbolic importance to it as well. I mean, Dave came from a pretty colorful past, and then I really wanted him to feel that he had been cleansed from head to toe. I wanted him to feel that complete sense of being washed through what Christ did. And when he came out of the water and threw his arms up in the air, that was pretty cool.
And so to this day, anytime I'm around Bill, I have a life jacket on if there's water close by.
So before we start into questions, I would love to know how that story landed on each of you. Dorothy and Doris, who's out of the picture right now, but I know she's listening. Hi, Doris. Come off of mute and tell us what you thought about that.
Don't give up on people. 8 years.
8 years, imagine that.
Ooh, that's enough to just say, you know what, he will never change. He will never come to accept Christ. So all is just, it just gives us that idea that we should just continue to stay on our knees for those we love. Yeah. It's not in our hands to change them. When the time comes, God is going to do what God is going to do.
And how many moms and grandmoms are praying for their children, and it 40 years before they accept Christ? Yeah. Deb, what was your reaction? You'll have to come off mute to tell us.
That's a message of hope. As you know, I have a son who informed me about 6 years ago now that he no longer believes. And we prayed for him. My mothers prayed for him. My favorite children. I try to be non-pushy, but yet drop seeds. And I mean, he spent 8 years, and then it came as a surprise. So I'm looking forward to the surprise.
Looking for the surprise, yeah. And
Yeah.
I'll tell you, there was something there at the end that I personally resonate with, and that was, or that resonated with me, and that was after all that time, he said, I got all my answers, my questions answered. And Bill said, and he hasn't looked back, solid as a rock. And I think that's part of my personal story, was that it was, yes, it was clearly a heart issue. It always will be. But for me, it had to be a head issue also. I had to understand not so much the mechanics, but the logic of the model of what salvation was all about. And so that, to me, and maybe Deb, for Chris, will be one of those where when that surprise happens, it'll be as solid as a rock. Mike, I'm going to invite you to share your thoughts on this too.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I can relate to it. The sense that we all have this different layers that have to peel off, and giving up things that are of this world for the next. And it's something I struggle with. So over time, you just chip away at those layers until eventually you get to that subsurface where, it's just you and God. And I just thought that was pretty poetic, and just continue to chip away at that outer shell.
Exactly. Well, thanks, Mike. So if you have your books on page 27, I'm going to start asking. Oh, sorry.
I had one more thought.
Yes, ma'am.
The end of it, he said he had a very colorful past.
Yes.
That's a lot of things. That's one of the things people struggle with, because they sit back and wonder if there's room for them when they look at themselves, and they wonder if Christ will accept them as they are. So that's one thing we have to make very conscious effort to let people know that come as you are. He has a big heart, and he's just going to accept you. It's not for you to decipher and think of how big your colorful past is. It's for him who has made it possible for you to come to him to do what he does best, which is to cleanse you and accept you and begin to remold and make you new again.
And as you say, it's not up to you, it's up to him. And he's already decided he will accept you.
Yes.
Regardless. Hey, and I'm glad you said that, Doris, because it reminded me of one thing I wanted to point out in there. You might have noticed in the drawing of the napkin, and he wrote God, and there was that little sketch, and then the friend referred to it. Well, the last session 4 will introduce you to that and a couple of other ways to share the gospel in very simple terms that are very powerful and meaningful. So I wanted to just mention, if you had questions about that, we're going to come back to that.
Thank you.
Living in 3D, the 3Ds are developing friendships, discovering stories, and discerning the next steps to take to introduce individuals to their faith walk. For the developing friendships, certainly it is easy for us to, as we, and I know we've observed it, as we get maybe further in our faith walk, we tend to surround ourselves with like-minded Christians. We pour ourselves into Bible studies and all the things going on in the activities of the church all week. And we tend to do what the author refers to as cocooning ourselves, protecting ourselves from the world, instead of going out into the world. Now, I know that Deb is very intentional about going out into the world with her pool group, and she's laughing because, I don't know, she knows I like to pick on her, but that's her intention. And me personally, as I'm able, I have, when I was first here, before Marion moved up, I was living in an apartment here in Fredericksburg for 2 years to be able to do this job. And I threw myself into a veteran service organization. And so I was involved 3 and sometimes 4 days a week doing things with this group that was not a, certainly not a faith-based organization. And as a result, similar to Deb, who's been called upon to be their informal chaplain for unbelievers, I've been called upon to be the chaplain for this group for different things. And I'm curious how you all, if there are ways, Dorothy and Mike and Doris, are there ways that you've been very intentional about placing yourself in communities with that are not necessarily faith-based communities, so that you can rub shoulders with people that might need to develop friendships and point toward Christ ultimately? So,
I think,
go ahead.
Doris, you're better off. Developing friendship is, for me, it's not something I would say I'm very strong at. I did mention it this afternoon to you. It's something that I have to work on in terms of, taking that steps, I guess, stepping out of, what you said in terms of being in a cocoon. I have to do that intentionally to step out.
Yeah. So over here on my left shoulder, Marion is the amen corner, because she is saying the same thing, and it's kind of painful for her to
Very painful.
But at this icebreaker exercise about neighbors, I mean, would it not make sense to just get to know your neighbors?
Well, again, that's Doris at least knows all of our neighbors, but I barely even know one.
You barely know one. Okay, well, there's
the only person I know is the lady. She came out, I was moving in to introduce herself, and we exchanged numbers, and that's about it.
Wow. Dorothy, all I got to say is this: you're depriving the world of your personality and so much. Get out there and
I know I have to work on it, and especially what you shared this afternoon. I know that, yeah, that's a challenge I have to take on.
Yeah. So, Mike, how about you? Do you see yourself going out and making friends, or intentional stepping outside of maybe your comfort zone that way?
Not so much anymore. I've cocooned myself with family, largely with the things we have going on. But, it's really interesting you bring this up, because right now I'm going through this phase of getting the house ready to possibly sell it in the next couple of years, because all my kids are grown up. So I don't have to be like right in the local area, an involved parent as much as I had been, with them being adults. So I'm going to be going through my own transition here in the next couple of years, figuring out, how my role is different, now that they're all up and out into the working world.
Yeah. Okay, so the amen corner is going again. The empty nest thing can be difficult. I'll tell you, Mike. I will say that the COVID has really screwed up your and my ability to maybe even figure out ways to hang out outside of work. And I've looked forward to previously, and I'm just up front, I will tell you, I had kind of hoped we'd be able to do that, and I still hold out hope that we can do that. I tried to set something up back several months ago with the men in the group, with Derek and Chuck and Eric and Dan, going on a fishing trip, doing a charter boat fishing trip. And with COVID, it just doesn't make sense for us to try to figure that out. And so many, missing opportunities to do that. But Mike, I want you to help hold me accountable to pestering you, so that you and I can do stuff together outside of that. Will you agree to do that?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Every Monday.
I mean, beyond that.
No, I mean, we'll bring it up every Monday.
Okay, there you go. Yeah. The rest of you, Mike and I have a standing meeting at work that we do. Well, that's just developing friendships, and the friendships are crucial, and they're crucial so that you can discover the stories, because you really can't know people and their stories, and everybody's got stories until you develop those friendships. So I wanted to ask on page 28, there are, I think both those questions are really good ones. In what ways can you relate to the various aspect of Super Dave's story? And some of the ones that might jog your memory, they listed negative religious experiences during the adolescent years. He witnessed a close friend submitting their life to Christ. There was a significant loss. For Dave, it was the death of his father, and a lengthy journey to faith in God. Are any of those or other ways that you recognized in Super Dave's story ones that you can relate to personally in your faith walk? Anybody?
Well, I think part of it is my struggle has been not the skepticism necessarily in God, but in the people who carry the message. Right? So you see a lot of just people will say one thing and do another. So they profess to be, godly. So they've got the Jesus fish on their car, but they're cutting people off in traffic, having road rage, that kind of thing, right? Yeah. So I just think of that kind of thing where you've got it's not necessarily God that's the problem. It's the vessel with the message and how they're choosing to articulate or not, right?
Right.
And that's been one of my struggles.
I think, Mike, that is probably the number one struggle that any Christian might have in doing evangelism, is facing how do you answer the hypocrisy of the church? And the hypocrisy ranges from things as mundane and pedestrian as the road rage, and flipping somebody off with the fish logo, all the way to the systematic or systemic issues like the priests molestation of little boys and those kind of things, and everything in between. And how do you address that? And that is a core challenge that we have as believers to overcome. So
just a little bit.
Absolutely.
I go to the pool hall, and of course they're drinking their beer and they're cussing and they're making gestures and doing things. And over the years, that has come down. But also over those years, I've sometimes slipped, and maybe I've said a bad word, or I've got upset with someone and had to go outside, and they tease me about going outside to pray so God could settle me down. But the conversation that has come from that is that none of us are perfect. And it might be someone driving around with the fish symbol on their car and then having the road rage. But at the same time, the people that have an issue now, I've had one lady whose son OD'd on heroin, and before she left, because they called her at school to let them know that had happened, before she left, she came directly over to me, which was directly opposite of the door, and said, "Would you please pray for my son and for me? I know God listens to you." Well, God listens to all of us. But that was a seed that was planted with her, and it was the first thing that she reached for, knowing she was going to the hospital and not going to know whether her child was going to be alive or dead. So I think sometimes, my husband's father wouldn't go to church because he said that the guys who were the elders in the church were the very ones who were ripping off people as car dealers during the week. Didn't mind selling you a car, it didn't work, didn't mind charging you too much, and how could they sit in there and be so pious? And church is a place, it's a hospital for broken people. It's not where the saints go and visit. It's where we go to receive grace. It's where we go to feel God's love. It's where we go to share that passion that we have, that Christ would think even us in our state of brokenness he was willing to give his life up for. So when someone approaches me and says, you know, you haven't done this or you haven't done that, you know what? I'm still a work in progress. I still have places in my life that need to be chiseled out. But if God can love me, I know he can love you.
Yeah.
And leave it at that. So I hope that helps some, Mike.
Why is it so important to understand people's stories? We talk about, you know, developing friendships so that you can discover their stories. Why is the discovery of stories so important?
I think it's because you don't know what's broke until you ask. You can't go to the doctor and have the doctor just, you know, just sit down and say, okay, fix me. You've got to find out what's wrong. And I think a lot of times that if we don't learn their story, if we don't find out what hurts, we can't show them how God can heal that hurt.
Yeah. Yeah, ultimately everything flows from a heart that's not right with God, but you know, that's going to be manifest in so many different ways. So, okay, good. And then discerning, you know, discovering or developing friendships, discovering stories, and then discerning next steps. Question number 6 on page 29 starts out, the simple expression of a heartfelt emotion is also played a pivotal role in helping Dave come to faith in Christ. How did it strike you when Bill told Dave, I'm not going to heaven without you, Soup?
So I think one of the tenets of really great leaders is the ability to be vulnerable when it matters most, right?
Oh,
and so
Brene Brown.
Yeah, I know, right? Yeah, and that's part of it. I think the other thing too, trust isn't built in the story itself. It's built in how you respond and react to the person's life story, right? So if you're reacting with genuine care and concern, that leaves a different powerful message than if you're doing it with the ulterior motive, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's the difference between the two is making the connection, so that when you do plant those seeds, they do take hold and they grow. But that's God doing the work of getting those seeds to germinate and fertilizing them. All you have to do is just find those right moments. But if you're not paying attention, if you're not dialed into that person, then you're going to miss the opportunity. You won't make a connection.
Yeah, when he said that, it was just so spontaneous, right? He said, hey, I'm not going to heaven without you. That had to have been a powerful moment because it came straight from the heart. It wasn't a decision. It just blurted it. So, all right, I'd like to play the closing video and then we have a couple more questions after that. But this is the summary video.
Unfortunately, I think the tendency for Christ followers is that the longer you walk with God, the more your relational world is inhabited by other Christ followers. It's not necessarily a bad thing, it's just how it works. And even some statistics would indicate that if you've been a Christian 5, 10, 15 years, you barely cross paths anymore with someone who's far from God. You watch Christian television, listen to Christian radio, you go to Christian events, you're involved in church work, and pretty soon it's just the totality of your existence. And so I have always felt I have to get a bit more intentional about making sure that I have proximity to people who are far from God. And I still argue the case that one of the best ways to do that is to find what your recreational passion is and then try to pursue it in the context of a group of people who aren't filled with faith yet. And because then you have the unifying factor of the recreational passion that you all enjoy. And if the Holy Spirit is alive and well in you, over time, the Spirit's work in and through your life will probably open some doors to further spiritual conversations. Usually when I'm in the process of my everyday life, and I'm looking at the people around my world, I think to myself, you know, I should be developing friendships. That's what I think Christ followers do. And in the context of developing friendships, I think I should probably, before I say what's on my mind, I should discover the stories of the people that I'm developing friendships with. I mean, their lives, their backgrounds, their pain, what they've been through matters. I mean, it matters to God, it ought to matter to me. And then all I want to do is discern what a next step would be. How can I contribute to their life? How can I add value? Not just spiritual value. How can I add practical value? How can I serve them in some way that would honor God and help them? I try to remind people who are serious about evangelism that even beneath the value of evangelism is the value of love. Radically accepting love. And you will not go wrong. Heaven will never be disappointed if the bottom line value is love. I think what Dave is doing with his life these days is like the ultimate irony. I mean, here's a guy who never went to church in his adult life, and he spends 40 or 50 hours every week trying to serve churches who are outreach oriented and trying to reach guys like he was. And when I see him counseling pastors these days, I want to crack up laughing because this is a guy I had to drag out of party tents and it just had a whole bunch of vivid memories with in his pre-Christian days, and how God's using him now is one of the great joys of my life.
It's one of my favorite lines in this entire video-based study is when he says, just love people. Just love people. We could end it there, but we're not. I want to ask you a few more closing questions. One of the things that this study has encouraged us to do is to identify, if you know from the last series, the Brians in your life. That is that individual who was far from God. You somehow came into your circle of influence and then became friends. And identify that person and begin to pray for that person and pray for the opportunities. And so perhaps you have not yet identified a Brian in your life. And the icebreaker for this session was about your neighbors. So maybe there's a Brian who is one of your neighbors that you want to go and get to know and find out more and develop a friendship with that person and then discover their stories and then try to discern next steps. So take a moment now, just I'll even shut up for a moment and let you think about who might a Brian or two in your life be. Now, I hope this moment wasn't too painful. Maybe I even should have given you more time. But as you think about that particular individual, the three questions related to developing a friendship with that Brian, discovering Brian's story, and discerning the next step in Brian's life, how can you continue to practice a bottom line value of love toward that person, regardless if they have ever made a faith decision or not? So developing a friendship, how can you continue to practice a bottom line value of love with that person? This is rhetorical, not looking for out loud answers. The second one, in discovering stories, what's one question you could ask to understand their life's journey better? A question you could ask to understand their life's journey better. And then lastly, to discern next steps, what resources might God be prompting you to provide that person? Maybe it's a book, maybe it's a CD, maybe it's just to be there to listen to something, or a few hours of conversation. Given the COVID, maybe it's conversation out in the front yard. So with that, I'd like to close us out in prayer, but before I do, does anyone have any other thoughts on this study on living in 3D, developing friendships, discovering stories, and discerning next steps?
No, it's just when you mentioned that we should think about the Browns in our lives. I guess Doris and I sort of giggle because we didn't have to think too far, because we've had a conversation about the person, actually our neighbor, who I think over time shared that her story. And I was almost sort of encouraged to say, well, she's an ideal candidate, you know, and I guess Doris was feeling that, well, we're not quite there yet, or we're not ready, you know, but I was ready to jump in. So, hey, it's quite interesting where, you know, you mentioning that again tonight. So
Interesting.
I just wanted to share that.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Okay, let's pray. God, I thank you for opening our hearts in just another, take back another layer, layer of our hearts to look like your heart, to have a heart for people, to have a heart that looks at the world through your eyes and recognizes that there is one and only one way to the Father, and that's through your Son, Jesus Christ. And so, Jesus, I pray, first of all, for courage for everyone in the hearing of my voice, that they have the courage to step out of their comfort zone and develop the friendship that may be as unlikely as anything they would have ever considered, or maybe as natural as going out together for a run or a walk or a shopping trip. Regardless, Lord, open our eyes to opportunities around us to develop friendships with those in this world who are lost, hurting, broken, and who clearly need the saving grace of a loving Father. Jesus, as we learn who these people are, and you give us the courage to develop those friendships, give us the guidance to know how to ask questions, to know their stories, to understand what their life journey has been, and to help understand the way their faith journey may continue. And with that, Lord, give us the wisdom to discern the next steps, not to bash them about the head and shoulders with a club or a Bible, but rather just love them, Lord. Help us to know how to love them. Jesus, we pray these things tonight with hearts yearning to be just like yours, just like Jesus. And it's in your precious and holy name I pray. Amen. Folks, thank you for being on tonight. And tell somebody that wasn't here that they're missing a really good study. All right. Well.